Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in. This is the first episode in a series of 10 videos on the reliability of the Gospels. The Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which talk about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So if you're curious why Christians believe that we can trust the story of Jesus, you've come to a good place. My name is Matthew. I have a master's degree from Talbot School of Theology, and I work as a speaker and author with Josh McDowell Ministry, and I look forward to spending our time together. Please feel free to ask questions along the way in the comments or privately on any of my social channels, which are listed in the description of all my videos. I'd love to hear from you and be a small part of your own journey wrestling through these important questions about Jesus. Let's get into it. As we dive into the reliability of the Gospels, there are 2 questions we need to discuss. First, are the words we have today the same words that were written down nearly 2,000 years ago, or did the words change over time? Second, are the words we have today true? In this video, we'll look at the first of these 2 questions. The following videos will focus on the second question. The books of the Bible were written thousands of years ago on material that typically lasted for only a couple hundred years. So the original writings of the Gospels are long gone. Instead, we have copies of the original writings. These copies are called manuscripts, and they are all different from each other in subtle ways because people make mistakes in the process of copying manuscripts. In order to reconstruct what the original would have said, it helps to have as many copies as possible so that we can cross-check them with one another. We also look for the age of these manuscripts. Manuscripts that date closer to the time of the original writing have less time to become corrupted by mistakes or changes. In both of these questions, the New Testament does far better than any other ancient document in history. If we take the New Testament, which is the writings about Jesus and content from his disciples, we have around 5,800 manuscripts in the original language, and almost 2,300 of them include text of the Gospels. To put this in perspective, most ancient historical writings of high regard have around a couple hundred manuscripts. Plato's tetralogies have about 237. The plays of Sophocles have about 226. The next runner-up after the New Testament is Homer's Iliad, with around 1,900 manuscripts. Compared to the average ancient text, that's incredible. But compared to the New Testament, it's really small. We also have a lot of manuscripts written very early after the original. According to New Testament scholar Dan Wallace, a manuscript specialist, today we have as many as 12 manuscripts from the 2nd century, 64 from the 3rd, and 48 from the 4th, a total of 124 manuscripts within 300 years of the composition of the New Testament. Most of these are fragmentary, but the whole New Testament text is found in this collection multiple times. If a manuscript lasts an average of several hundred years, then the earliest manuscripts we have may well be only a small handful of generations removed from the original. If there were only a few generations of copies, we would expect the manuscripts to be pretty close. There would be some spelling differences, some words missing or copied twice by mistake, and for the most part, that's all we get when comparing our earliest manuscripts. But that's no reason to doubt our confidence in what the original would have said. For the sake of example, let's say I have 4 different manuscripts which read as follows. Everyone left her home when the party died down. Everyone left her home as the party died down. Everyone left as the party died down. Everyone left her home when the party died down. Even after these differences, do you have a sense of what the original was trying to communicate? Certainly. When the party died down, people went home. The exact wording is less clear, but the 4th manuscript has an obvious spelling mistake. One of them doesn't mention the people going home, but all the others do. It's not clear whether people left when or as the party died down, but the meaning is essentially the same. With actual manuscripts, we would have more to go by, like the dating. So let's imagine that the earliest ones use a word when, making reading 1 most likely the closest to the original. If we turned to the internal evidence for these manuscripts, looking at the larger context of the writing, looking at the typical styles and writing behaviors of the authors, we might be able to get even closer to an accurate and confident assessment of what the original text would have said. When you work with manuscripts of the Gospels and the Bible in general, the vast majority of your problems are not much different than this. There are some tricky spots, but there is no important doctrine or fundamental teaching of Christianity jeopardized by the differences in our manuscripts. What if the Gospels were intentionally changed? Well, our early manuscripts come from different places around the Middle Eastern world. It's not like any person could travel the Middle Eastern world and change all of the manuscripts without the churches noticing. For this to work, they would have to access the text of the Gospels before it was copied and spread around the world. But how would they have known that the text was important enough to mess with until after it was already starting to spread? There's just no good reason to suspect that we've lost the meaning of the original text either by accident or by malicious intent. Since we can be confident that the text we have today reflects the text that was written down, we are ready to ask if the text written down is true. We're going to be rolling out a new video every week, so go ahead and subscribe if you want to keep up with the series, and I'll see you then. Hey everyone, this is the second video in a series on the historical reliability of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Last week, we asked whether the original text of the Gospels is the same text we have today. This week, we will start to examine if we can trust the text to be true. In this video, I'm asking, who wrote the four Gospels? From a historical perspective, it doesn't quite matter who wrote the Gospels. What matters is whether the Gospels are true. However, if we know the authors, when they lived, how closely they associated with Jesus, we will be in a better position to determine whether their writings can be trusted. The four Gospels are named after their traditional authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was a tax collector and disciple of Jesus. Mark was an associate of Peter, a disciple of Jesus. Luke was a traveling companion with Paul, one of the first missionaries who claimed to have encountered Jesus. John was also a disciple of Jesus and one of the closest among the 12. This puts all four of these men in a good position to write about Jesus. You may have heard people say that the four Gospels are anonymous. This, I believe, is an oversimplification of the issue. Our earliest copies include descriptions at the start which say the Gospel according to Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. From a literary perspective, scholars consider this to be unusual, and so they suggest that these words were added when the four Gospels started to circulate together, maybe sooner. Whatever the case, we don't need to have names explicitly written down. There's other reasons for believing the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For instance, there is no competing tradition for the four authors. The only exception I'm aware of would be a small group who denied the authorship of John near the end of the 2nd century, but that didn't last. The ancient writer Irenaeus is one important author who affirmed the authors of the four Gospels. He personally knew Polycarp, who knew John, the disciple of Jesus. This puts him in a great position to know who wrote the four Gospels, especially John. Many other writers from church history could be given, and they speak about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as if there is no doubt, probably because there wasn't any doubt. As far as we can tell, the whole church knew the authorship of these Gospels. It appears these writings always had a name associated with them, even if the name wasn't written down. In that sense, they really weren't anonymous. Some modern scholarship has denied one or more of the authors, although it's usually after ignoring the early church writings or dismissing them far too quickly. For instance, some would say that Matthew is not the author of the first Gospel because Matthew was an eyewitness disciple of Jesus, and yet he appears to have drawn from Mark. So they ask, why would an eyewitness need to use a source? Well, maybe the Gospel of Mark had so much acceptance by the early church that Matthew knew it would be good to use in his material, and he didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Others point out that the first Gospel comes from a perspective that shows a deeper relationship with the Jews than one would expect to find in Matthew. But who's to say Matthew didn't know how to speak to his audience? Others look to Papias, who said Matthew wrote his Gospel in Hebrew, and they think Papias was wrong about Matthew because he was wrong about Hebrew. But everyone is wrong about some stuff and right about other stuff. It seems to me that the modern scholars who write against the traditional authors of the Gospels are speculating far too much. I think we would be justified to push against them because of the unanimous understanding from all the writers who lived within the first few hundred years of Jesus. These early authors would have had many more resources that we don't have today. They would have more connections with other people who knew about the Gospels. They would have been in a much better position to know who wrote the Gospels than those of us living nearly 2,000 years later. Another reason for rejecting the traditional authors is that we have writings of Jesus from early Christians who falsely attributed names to their writings. They say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John might be similar. For instance, the Gospel of Peter was not written by Peter. The Gospel of Thomas was not written by Thomas. For these books, we have good reasons to deny their authorship, and it's no surprise that the early church rejected these books because they knew it just as well as we do. But it doesn't follow that we would deny Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have to evaluate these books on a case-by-case basis, and that's what I've been doing. In fact, you look at the Gospel of Peter or Thomas, those are exciting names to have as a gospel. Gosh, wouldn't it be cool if we had a gospel of Jesus written by the legend Peter himself? Certainly. That's why his name was falsely attributed to the Gospel of Peter. It adds credibility, it draws interest. Same with Thomas, Philip, and others. Matthew, on the other hand, yes, he was a disciple of Jesus, but he was a tax collector. Jews did not like tax collectors. If you wanted to falsely attribute a name to the first gospel, you wouldn't use Matthew. Mark and Luke were not disciples at all, so their names were unlikely to have been fabricated. John would have been a compelling name to use if somebody wanted to, but based on everything else I've shared earlier in this video, I don't think there's good evidence for us to go there. Another reason to deny the traditional authorship is if you think the books were written after the supposed authors would have lived. Of course, this depends on how you date the Gospels. This will be the subject of our next video. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our series on the reliability of the Gospels. Last week, I gave some reasons why I believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the four Gospels of Jesus. But all of this falls apart if, as many people suggest, the Gospels were written after these people would have lived. So let's look at how the Gospels are dated and what dating makes the most sense. Many will date the Gospels after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. One important reason is that Jesus predicts the temple's destruction in Mark, which turned out to become true. Since predictive prophecy is considered impossible, they figure that Mark must have been written after the event happened. Since Mark was likely the earliest of the four Gospels, the others would have been written even later. This puts all four Gospels near the end of the 1st century, or maybe into the beginning of the 2nd century after Jesus' generation would have all passed away. The problem with this reasoning is that it assumes Jesus could not have possibly predicted a future event. That assumption is yet to be determined based on whether or not the Gospels are reliable sources of Jesus. If they are reliable, then we can trust that Jesus really was sent from God who did miracles, rose from the dead, and had a supernatural insight to predict the temple's destruction. We must be careful not to insert anti-supernatural bias into the Gospels in our attempt to determine whether or not they are true. If we do this, we will inevitably determine that they aren't true before we even begin the investigation. I would agree with many others who advocate for an earlier dating of the Gospels. One important reason is this. The book of Luke was composed by the same author who wrote the book of Acts. Acts tells about the life of Peter, Paul, and the events happening in Jerusalem and the early church. But Acts has a very sudden ending that doesn't sound like a proper way to close a book. It ends as if the author caught up to real time. This is where it gets interesting. Curiously, Acts tells nothing about the death of Peter or the death of Paul. It doesn't mention the destruction of the temple in 70 AD or the siege that took place before then. These were cataclysmic events. Now imagine that you read a book on Abraham Lincoln, but the book said nothing about Lincoln's assassination. It would be reasonable to assume that the book was written before 1865 when he died. If you read a book about the history of New York City, but the book never mentioned the attack on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, you would reasonably assume that the book was written before September 2001, when the towers were destroyed. The deaths of Peter, Paul, and the destruction of Jerusalem were just as significant for the early church. It's hard to imagine they would be left out of Acts unless Acts was written earlier, probably the mid-60s. We know the book of Luke was written before Acts, so that places Luke even earlier. Luke appears to have drawn from Mark, placing Mark even earlier than Luke, long before the temple's destruction, well within the time frame of Jesus' generation. As for Matthew, the early church writer Irenaeus says that he wrote while Peter and Paul were preaching and founding the church in Rome. That puts him in the 60s, close to Luke. This fits. Matthew includes teachings of Jesus that would have felt more relevant to his contemporary audience while the temple was still standing. His writing includes features that were common at the time. It aligns with the rest of church tradition. And there's evidence that Luke quoted from Matthew, placing his writing earlier than Luke's. John's dating is probably the hardest to nail down. For a while, it was thought to have been very late, like near the end of the 2nd century, because the gospel makes some of the strongest statements of Jesus' divinity. Scholars suggest that such high views of Jesus did not develop until later, although ever since a manuscript of John dating to 130 AD was discovered, we realize that John must have been written before then. After looking at tradition, linguistic evidence, and historical context, New Testament scholars D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo suggest that John's most likely dating is between 80 and 85 AD, which would have been closer to the end of John's life. With an earlier dating, the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is possible. With the evidence of their authorship that I shared in the previous video, their authorship is probable. Therefore, the Gospels were written by people who would be in a good position to really know about the life of Jesus. However, none of this matters if they never intended to talk about real events in history. So, next week, we will ask if these 4 individuals were intending to record history when they wrote their Gospels. Obviously, if the Gospels were intended as allegories or inspirational bedtime stories, we wouldn't want to treat them like actual history. So we'll talk about that. Should be good. I'll see you then. We are here on video 4 talking about the historical reliability of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Glad you could make it. Today we are asking, did the authors intend to record history? To be clear, I'm not asking whether or not they were lying. We'll discuss that later. In this video, I am asking if they wanted their readers to believe that the stuff they say about Jesus really happened. Almost every scholar of the New Testament, whether Christian or not, would say yes. The authors of the gospel books intended their books to be taken as history. They never wanted their audience to think that the gospels were giant allegories or that they were fictional novels or fairy tale bedtime stories. Luke is very explicit about this at the beginning of his gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. This is pretty cut and dry. Luke's material also draws from Mark, which means he understood that Mark was speaking historically as well. John's Gospel makes a similar statement near the end of his book. After sharing about the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, he said in John 20:31, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Why should they believe that Jesus is a Messiah or Savior? Because Jesus really did all the marvelous things that John talked about. Besides all these more explicit statements from Luke and John, all 4 of the Gospels were written in a style that appears historical. According to New Testament scholar Craig Blumberg, there's an important piece of implicit evidence that can't be overlooked. Consider the way the Gospels are written in a sober and responsible fashion, with accurate incidental details, with obvious care and exactitude. You don't find the outlandish flourishes and blatant mythologizing that you see in a lot of other ancient writing. If you open the Gospels and just pick a page, you'll see what he's talking about. As an example, Matthew begins by tracing the lineage of Jesus back to Abraham. He goes on to say, "This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet he did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, 'The virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel,' which means God with us." Matthew attaches Jesus to a real family tree, and then he says that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of a virgin birth. He doesn't linger on the interesting details like the angel. Instead, he just tells things in a very plain, matter-of-fact kind of way. This, then this, then this, then this. Matthew's style is what you would expect of someone speaking from a historical perspective. He does not write in a style of an allegory or literary epic. Another example is Mark 7. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on them. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means "be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Mark includes all of these incidental details like Jesus' travel plans. He quotes Jesus speaking Aramaic and then translates for his Greek audience. This information does not have the typical tone that comes with allegorical writing. The text reads like a historical report. Luke 3, 1-3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. He went into all the country around the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Again, you'll be hard-pressed to call this allegory or fiction. Luke is carefully detailing the life of Jesus in real space-time. Granted, a lot of modern novels are quite detailed, but that's a recent development. It was never the case with ancient fiction. C.S. Lewis was known as a Christian writer, but professionally, he was an academic of literature who did a lot of work with allegory. In talking about the Gospel of John, he said, "I have been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that not one of them is like this. Of this text, there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage or else some other unknown writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative." I think a reason people get tripped up on this is because the Gospels have spiritual undertones, lessons to be learned, and occasional literary touches along the way. But that doesn't mean they're not also historical. Yes, the Gospels have an obvious theological agenda, and they are written to strengthen and encourage the early church. But that doesn't mean the historical element was not just as important. The lessons and teachings and theology of the Gospels are all grounded on the historical events they purport to share. We really have no reason to think it must be one or the other, especially since the historical intentions are so firmly established. Even literary parallels like Jesus reliving the ministry of Old Testament characters can be affirmed without denying the historical background, especially if you're open to the idea that God might have been orchestrating history in such a remarkable way. Next week will be our 5th video in this series on the reliability of the Gospels. We're going to ask if the authors were able to record history. Maybe they wanted to write history, but they would not have been able to do it well. If that's the case, we should not trust the historical reliability of the Gospels. But as you'll see, I think we can be confident in their ability to tell us accurate information about the life of Jesus. I'll see you then. Welcome back to our 5th video in a series on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Today we will ask if the authors were able to record history. Are they good candidates to tell us about the life of Jesus? Let's get into it. In a previous video, I showed that the authors of the Gospels were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John were disciples or students of Jesus, making them excellent sources to talk about Jesus. They spent more time with Jesus than almost anyone else. Mark worked closely with Peter to compose his gospel, and Peter was a disciple of Jesus as well. Luke's closest connection to Jesus was Paul. Although Paul was not one of Jesus' 12 disciples, he had an experience seeing the resurrected Jesus, which transformed his life. Paul was also connected to Peter and others, and he was entrusted by the early church to carry forth the story of Jesus around the world. Luke's gospel and his subsequent book of Acts is written in a style that is distinct from the other three gospel writers. His higher vocabulary and orderly style appear to be the work of a careful historian. All four of the gospel writers, then, are in a good position to give us an accurate account of the life of Jesus. We might wonder if the authors were influenced from bias. You might even hear atheists or skeptics completely dismiss the historical value of the Gospels because the authors are Christian. After all, a well-intentioned reporter may distort information if they have strong bias for or against the topic in discussion. Now, everyone is biased to some degree, and it's no secret that the authors of the Gospels were themselves very much biased toward Christian belief. But just as bias can distort a report, it can also strengthen the care put into a report. Christian belief puts an emphasis on truth and honesty. As Christians, they would want to talk about Jesus rightly. And consider this: the early followers of Jesus were persecuted for their faith. So if the Christians are going to talk about the life of Jesus, they, more than anyone, would want to talk about Jesus accurately. Certainly, they would never want to suffer for telling a story that they were mistaken about. In this case, I wouldn't worry about bias working against their ability to recount what happened. A much bigger objection to the competency of these authors is that they wrote so long after the events they talk about. As I argued in a previous video, Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote probably in the 60s, John maybe in the 80s, but Jesus was killed in the early 30s. That means there were decades between the life of Jesus and the time when those gospel books were produced. Certainly you know from experience that memory fades even after a few weeks. Incidental details, like what you had for breakfast, can be forgotten within hours. So how could the disciples of Jesus possibly remember what happened decades ago? First, we have to acknowledge the culture that these authors lived in. Back in their time and place, the people transferred information primarily through spoken words rather than written words. It was commonplace to retain large amounts of information by rote memorization, and so their brains adapted and they were very good at it. Second, Jesus' words are spoken in a way that would have allowed for easy memorization. New Testament scholar Craig Blumberg pointed out that 80 to 90% of Jesus' words were written in a poetic fashion. That doesn't mean they rhymed, but they had a distinct rhythm, meter, parallels, and so forth. This would have aided in memory help. Third, it's easy to remember information if you are teaching it regularly. Since the disciples of Jesus were founders and leaders of the early church, they would have been talking about Jesus frequently, keeping all of their memories fresh until the gospel books were composed. Working together, if they felt themselves starting to forget an important detail, the others could have helped them out. Likewise, if one of them started to exaggerate or give false information, the others would have corrected them. Fourth, although the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written decades after Jesus, there's no reason to think that other unpublished writings of Jesus never existed before then. While traveling with Jesus, the disciples would have known that Jesus was making history, so it seems reasonable to suggest that at least some of them were taking notes along the way, or shortly after Jesus left them. These notes could have been used later when they decided to sit down and write their Gospels. Fifth, even if we can't trust the authors to remember small details, the Gospels focus on major events and teachings of Jesus. These events would have seared into their brain just as we remember details more clearly for important days or events of our own life. If you witness a blind person receive sight, or a crippled person start walking, or your own teacher resurrect from the dead 3 days after he was brutally murdered on a cross, you're going to remember those events vividly. Those events, and especially the resurrection, matter tremendously for those seeking to understand if Christianity is true. All things considered, I believe we can trust that the authors of the Gospels were able to record history. But there's one other conceivable problem you might hear that would affect their ability to give us an accurate report: whether or not their memories of Jesus were distorted under the influence of pagan gods in their own time. Maybe you've heard it said that Jesus was just a copy of older mythologies of dying and rising gods. We'll talk about that in the next video. I'll see you then. As we continue in our series about the historical reliability of the Gospels, we have to ask whether the writers were influenced by pagan myths of dying and rising gods. The argument goes that Jesus is no different and just a continuation of these myths that have developed over time. Let's take a look if this actually works with the Gospels. Is Jesus really just a copy of pagan gods? Today, the argument has been almost completely rejected by Christian and non-Christian scholars of the New Testament since the mid-1900s, but it still circles around on the internet and in popular media. For instance, the movie Religulous puts it this way. Written in 1280 BC, the Egyptian Book of the Dead describes a god, Horus. Horus is a son of the god Osiris, born to a virgin mother. He was baptized in a river by Anup the baptizer, who was later beheaded. Like Jesus, Horus was tempted while alone in the desert, healed the sick, the blind, cast out demons, and walked on water. He raised Asar from the dead. Asar translates to Lazarus. Oh yeah, he had 12 disciples. Yes, Horus was crucified first, and after 3 days, 2 women announced Horus, the savior of humanity, had been resurrected. Despite the apparent similarities between Jesus and previous gods of pagan mythology, the theory that Jesus was copied from pagan mythology is problematic for many reasons. First, if you just stop and fact-check the details of these pagan gods, you'll find that many of them are completely made up or so violently distorted to look like Jesus that they don't offer compelling evidence. Second, a lot of the comparisons are not very surprising when you think about it. A man who claimed to be a savior, performed miracles, healed people, and had followers is not all that unusual. Even stories of dying and rising gods are not that surprising to find in history. People of the ancient past were deeply interested in cycles of life and death, probably because of their annual vegetation cycle, where plants would grow, die, and grow back again. Their ancient gods would likewise die and resurrect in a similar fashion, repeating the process every year. Third, the fact that we see parallels to Jesus in previous gods might be because the real God of this universe placed in every human heart the subconscious longing for a person like Jesus. This longing inevitably inspired imaginative stories of ancient gods, but it all happened for real in the life of Jesus. So the argument for or against Jesus could go either way, depending on the Christian or non-Christian perspective that we hold. Fourth, these comparisons often ignore what is profoundly unique to the Christian message. Osiris, for instance, though raised by Isis, did not return in a resurrected body, but became king of the underworld. Though ancient pre-Jesus religions talk about salvation, it's nothing like the Christian view of salvation. There's no emphasis on doctrine, which is the whole foundation of Christian teaching, no emphasis on grace or forgiveness. There's no public declaration of a real bodily resurrection. The death of gods was not sacrificial or voluntary. These are very significant differences. Fifth, the argument that Jesus is a copy from previous gods suffers from what you would call the genetic fallacy. It doesn't follow that one event is influenced by an earlier event. For example, you would never say that the moon landing in 1969 was fake because the original Star Trek came out 3 years earlier. It's an interesting coincidence to see such an imaginary tale of space travel take place before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, but the stories are completely unrelated. Sixth, the religious Jews were not syncretistic. In other words, they did not blend ancient religion with their own. Christianity, likewise, was very adamant to not follow other gods, but to follow Christ alone. Knowing how these people felt about pagan religion, it's practically impossible to imagine that the entire life of Jesus would have been assembled through a patchwork of all these other gods. Seventh, many of these details about pagan gods often come from writings after the time of Jesus, even if the gods of the stories come from writings before the time of Jesus. What this means is that the life of Jesus may have influenced the teachings of Horus, Osiris, or other pagan gods, not the other way around. Eighth, as I shared in a previous video in this series, the Gospels are grounded in historical teachings, not mythological teachings. The life of Jesus is documented both by Christians and non-Christians who saw him as a real person who lived, taught, and died on the cross. When we discuss Jesus, we are working with something entirely different than mythology. As you will see in future videos within this series, there's a good reason to believe that the accounts of Jesus are true. That sets Jesus apart from the other gods before him. So in the next video, we're going to look at a very important question. Were the authors of the 4 Gospels trying to tell the truth, or were they lying? I'll see you then. Hey everyone, this is the 7th video in a series talking about the historical reliability of the Gospels. Welcome back. Previously, I tried to show that the gospel stories were written to discuss history, and they were written by people who would be able to discuss it accurately. Now, we are ready to ask a different question. Were the authors lying? Let's get into it. When we explore whether or not the gospel writers were lying about Jesus, we are dealing with motive. What was their motive for writing the gospels? People often say that it's impossible to know a person's motive, and so they think that a project like what I'm about to do is worthless. However, even though we don't have direct access to the person's motive, we can still observe their lives and their writing to help us draw clues whether or not they wrote honestly. We will never know with 100% certainty whether the apostles were lying or not, but we can still think through the issues and reach a conclusion with a good level of confidence. For instance, is there any evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John were dishonest or immoral individuals? Not really. The content of their Gospels reflects some of the highest standards for moral living that you will ever see. Take Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew 5-7 and Luke 6. Why would Matthew or Luke want to generate lies about Jesus teaching against immorality and dishonesty? Similar examples could be given with Mark and John. Another reason we can trust the authors were being honest is that their reports include details that you would not expect to see if they were being dishonest. Likewise, they do not include details that you would expect to see if they were being dishonest. Let me show you what I mean. If you are making up a story, you would not include details that make your heroes look bad. And yet frequently, the Gospels of Jesus are almost humorous because the disciples of Jesus consistently appear clueless. When Jesus teaches, they frequently misunderstand him or fail to make sense of his words entirely. They argue with each other over who's the greatest, which flies against the humility of Jesus. On many occasions, they lack faith. James and John were rebuked by Jesus when they wanted to call down fire from heaven against their enemies. Peter was impulsive. He denied knowing Jesus 3 times. At one point, Jesus even called him Satan. When Jesus was arrested, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest against the will of Jesus. Peter was a fisherman, not a master swordsman. I don't think he was aiming for the ear. Sounds to me like he was going for the head. These people were leaders of the early church at the time when these stories about them were written. Why would they include these stories? The only conceivable reason that we see the disciples of Jesus painted in a bad or embarrassing light is because the authors of the Gospels were concerned about accuracy. They were committed to giving a true report, even if it meant giving an unflattering account of their own leaders. In addition to embarrassing details, the Gospels also include hard or difficult teachings of Jesus. For instance, in Matthew 5, Jesus taught that a person who is angry with his brother will be liable to God's judgment as if they committed murder. He taught that if you look at a woman lustfully, you have committed adultery in your own heart. He taught that if someone sues you and takes your tunic, give him your cloak as well. He taught that you must love your enemies. Elsewhere, Jesus taught that if you truly want to follow him, you may need to abandon your own family and you will suffer severely. If the Gospels wanted to fabricate a story of Jesus to generate a following, why would they make Jesus look so unattractive? A better explanation for the hard teachings of Jesus is that they wanted to report the truth. The Gospels also include details that could easily lead to theological problems. For instance, if Jesus really was God, as the early church believed, why does Mark 11:12 say that Jesus was hungry? Why does Matthew 24:36 say that Jesus does not know the time of his second coming? Why does Matthew 13:58 and Mark 6:5 tell of a time when Jesus did not or could not perform many miracles? Why does John 2 make Jesus appear out of control when he drives people from the temple with a whip, flipping tables and pouring out coins? There are actually some good reasons why Jesus said and did these things, but my point is that the gospel writers could have made their job a lot easier if they never even mentioned it. Again, it appears that they included these details because they wanted to tell the truth of what actually happened. Even further, if the gospels were made up, why do they say that women were the first witnesses at the empty tomb of Jesus? In that time, the reports of women were considered less reliable than the reports of men. The empty tomb was a crucial detail in the resurrection of Jesus, so it would be unlikely that women would be the first witnesses of the empty tomb unless it actually happened that way, and the gospel writers were committed to telling the truth. In addition to the hard, difficult, or embarrassing details in the Gospels, there are also some details missing that you would expect to find if the Gospels were made up. For instance, one of the debates in the early church was whether or not non-Jewish Christian men should be circumcised. Jesus taught a lot of different things, but he never addressed this question directly. If the Gospel writers were dishonest, they could have easily solved the issue by putting words in Jesus' mouth. Likewise, another debate was whether or not dietary restrictions were lifted after the cross. Before then, the Jews were not allowed to eat the meat of animals considered unclean, but it wasn't clear if that remained the case for all the Christian believers after Jesus was gone. Consider how Mark addresses the issue. And Jesus called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" Thus he declared all foods clean. Funny enough, my example of food laws incidentally includes an example of the disciples embarrassing themselves. But I want to draw you to the fact that Mark had to add a parenthetical statement at the end saying, "Look, in case you missed it, this is where Jesus declared all foods clean." This shows that the issue was important in Mark's time, but it leaves you wondering why Mark didn't just make it more obvious by putting that in Jesus' own words. Why didn't Mark have Jesus say, "Whatever food goes into a person cannot defile him"? The best explanation I can think is that they did not want to overstep themselves. They did not want to insert words into the mouth of Jesus. They wanted to be accurate. They refused to alter the story even a little, even if it made their jobs a whole lot easier. Lastly, it's hard to imagine that the gospel writers were lying for the simple reason that they lack motive. Why would they lie? What would they have to gain? The early followers of Jesus were persecuted. Many were beaten, tortured, bankrupt, denounced by their friends and family, or even killed for proclaiming Jesus. If they were looking for fame or fortune or popularity, they would have recanted all of it once they discovered how terribly their lives turned out. Even if they wanted to encourage their Jewish community with a fake story of hope, they would have recanted all of it after they saw their fellow Jews become Christian and experience the difficulties of persecution and suffering because of their faith. It simply doesn't make sense that they would ever want to lie about the life of Jesus. So far in this series, I showed that the authors intended to record history, they were able to record history, and they were not lying about history. At this point, we are starting to see a case for why the Gospels are reliable documents. However, there are more ways we can test the Gospels and other concerns that people have brought to the surface. Stick around as we get into these important questions in the coming weeks. I'll see you then. Welcome back to video 8 in our series on the historical reliability of the Gospels. So far, I've been speaking generally about why we can trust the Gospels, but in these coming videos, we're going to put them to the test. In this video, we are asking, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John consistent with each other? If their accounts of Jesus are vastly different from each other, then we have reason to doubt that any of them can be trusted. Let's take a look. From the perspective of a Christian like myself, holding to the belief that the Bible is completely true in everything it teaches, we need to show that there are no formal contradictions between the Gospels at all. But from a historical perspective, we should be willing to accept that a document can be generally trusted, even if there are some problems or inaccuracies along the way. For example, if you find 4 independent sources describing their experience on the Titanic when the ship struck an iceberg, you'll probably find some contradictions between them because people have different perspectives and they make mistakes. But that doesn't mean the general Titanic story isn't true. Even still, a lot of people will argue that the four Gospels are so inconsistent with each other that we can't trust any part of them. Examples abound. For instance, the family line of Jesus is different between Matthew and Luke. Some names are missing, other names are added. As an example, Luke presents Heli as the father of Joseph, whereas Matthew says Jacob is the father of Joseph. All four Gospels talk about different people at the empty tomb of Jesus. When Jesus was tempted by the devil 3 times, Matthew and Luke arranged the temptations in a different order. John has Jesus cleansing the temple near the beginning of his narrative. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus cleansing the temple near the end. According to Matthew, Jesus gave his famous Sermon on a Mountain, but Luke says Jesus taught on a level place. In Matthew, a Roman centurion asks Jesus to heal his paralyzed servant. In Luke, the centurion never visited Jesus. Instead, he sent elders to visit Jesus to speak on his behalf. As we consider all these differences between the Gospels, a couple of points need to be made. First, differences do not necessarily mean contradictions. Although all four Gospels mention different people at the empty tomb of Jesus, none of them claim to give a complete list. Instead, they simply focus on different people. This may seem like a stretch since each story leaves the impression that we are given a full picture, but that nagging feeling is just our cultural context which values precision. Back then, people were looser with their storytelling. Second, writers at that time were not so concerned about chronology, so we needn't be bothered by the temptations of Jesus being in a different order or John placing the temple cleansing much earlier than the other Gospels. They could have had theological lessons in mind as they assembled the material. Third, some apparent contradictions are not hard to harmonize if you just think about them for a minute. Although Matthew says that Jesus gave his Sermon on a Mountain and Luke on a flat place, it could have been a flat place on a mountain. Certainly, Jesus could have taught similar sermons at different times and places. Add a little bit of research to it. New Testament scholar D.A. Carson studied the Greek wording between Matthew and Luke, concluding that Matthew's mountain probably means hill country, and Luke's plain commonly refers to a plateau in a mountainous region. There's no contradiction here. On that note, my fourth point with apparent contradictions is that sometimes we just need to do a little more research. Regarding Matthew's centurion and Luke's 2 elders sent by the centurion, Leon Morris says, "It is better to see Matthew as abbreviating the story and leaving out details inessential to his purpose. What a man does through agents, he may be said to do himself." So Matthew simply gives the gist of the centurion's communication to Jesus, whereas Luke, in greater detail, gives the actual sequence of events. This goes to show that the gospel writers were not as concerned about precision as modern readers. If we read the Gospels according to their own standard, we are able to see that the apparent contradictions can be harmonized. Another example, with a little research, we see that the different family lines between Matthew and Luke could be explained when we consider that generations were commonly omitted, names might be added or removed from adoptions, marriages, or transfer of inheritance rights. Much of this is conjecture, but it shows that the family lines are not necessarily incompatible. I find that the vast majority of apparent contradictions can be resolved reasonably, and the remaining issues continue to fade as we learn more about the language and logic of first-century Jewish authors. These alleged contradictions are not as black and white as we make them out to be. If you pick up an apologetics study Bible, the pages of Scripture are filled with notes for almost any spot you could think that contains an apparent contradiction. Read through some of that when you get the chance, and it will really open up your mind to think more critically about the issues at hand. We should also recognize that it's good we have differences. If all 4 Gospels sounded exactly the same, then we don't have 4 accounts. We have 1 account from 4 people. At the end of the day, the Gospels are different enough to know that we have independent sources and similar enough to know that they do not contradict themselves. For the next video in this series, we will take a look at how the Gospels compare to what we know about the people, times, places, and events in which they are situated. I'll see you then. We are on video 9 in a series on the historical reliability of the Gospels. In this video, we are asking how they compare with other outside information. Do the Gospels mention people, places, and events that can be confirmed with our knowledge of history? Let's take a look. Quite a lot of work has been done comparing the Gospels to what we know about history. For instance, the first 3 chapters of Luke mention 11 historical leaders whose names are confirmed by sources outside the Gospels. This shouldn't surprise us given Luke's track record elsewhere. The historian Colin Hemmer chronicled 84 confirmed details in the last 16 chapters of Acts, also written by Luke. Since Matthew and Mark contain many of the same details in Luke, we could say, by comparison, that they are also historically accurate. John is probably the least trusted among the 4 Gospels by critical scholars, but New Testament scholar Craig Blumberg did a similar test on John's book to see how it aligns with our knowledge of history. Some confirmed details would be the use of stone water jars, the location of Jacob's well, the hostility between Jews and Samaritans, the topography of western Galilee, the location and description of the 5 colonnades at the pool of Bethesda, the location for the pool of Siloam, the distance from Bethany to Jerusalem, first-century burial wrappings, and the use of spices, Caiaphas as a high priest, the village of Ephraim, and many others. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek found at least 30 people mentioned in the New Testament who are confirmed by archaeology or ancient writings, saying that their search was not even exhaustive. Many of these people are from the 4 Gospels. Some people will object that the Gospels were wrong about other details. For instance, Pilate. Yes, he was a governor of the time, but in the Gospels he seems reluctant to make up his mind and somewhat a pushover when the Jews pressure him to crucify Jesus. Critics point out that Pilate was not a pushover and would have gladly done what he wanted to with Jesus without allowing the Jews to pressure him one way or another. But the Gospels give a good reason why Pilate would have been hesitant with Jesus. He found no crime deserving punishment. The issue was especially acute since a cross was reserved for the worst kinds of criminals. He eventually gave way to the Jews' pressure because of the unrest of the crowd's demands and because he was worried about what Jesus would mean for his relationship with Caesar. The story is not nearly as crazy or far-fetched as many would have us believe. Others will argue that Herod's massive slaughter of male children in Matthew 2:16 was made up. They say that certainly an event of this size would be recorded in history, but it's not. However, the Zondervan Bible Background Commentary has this to say: only 123 men returned to Bethlehem from the Babylonian deportation, and it appears not to have grown beyond a small village of perhaps 1,000 people at the birth of Jesus. Herod's forces kill all the infant boys under the age of 2 years, which would calculate to between 10 to 30 boys. Although this number of infant boys massacred would be a huge loss for the village of Bethlehem, it is not an incident that stands out significantly when seen in the light of other horrific events in Herod's infamous career, and historians would have easily bypassed it. Herod's massacre is one example of many details in the Gospels that you might think should have been talked about by other ancient writers. But just because it's not present in our historical knowledge outside the Gospels doesn't mean it didn't happen. Consider this. In that time, most people wouldn't bother to write stuff down because they primarily transferred information through word of mouth. Even if they wanted to write something, many of them were illiterate or did not have the proper materials. Even if they did write something, the material they wrote on would likely have dissolved after a few hundred years. The only reason we have any ancient historical writings is that copies were made to preserve the writing, but we should not take it for granted that everything a person writes will be preserved for us by copyists. All in all, we have plenty to show that the Gospels corroborate well with other historical details we know about outside the Gospels. It helps to show that they are historically reliable sources. Our final video coming up will put the Gospels through what you might consider to be the hardest test yet. What did the enemies of Christianity have to say about the Gospels? Do they admit some details were true? Do they sidestep the problems? If the Gospels contain any historical inaccuracies, you would expect the enemies of Christianity to be all over it. So stick around, and I'll see you then. Hey everyone, and welcome to the final video in a series we've been doing on the historical reliability of the Gospels. We've covered a lot here, but there's one last question I want to ask about these books. Do the enemies of Christianity claim that the Gospels contain false information? Let's dive into it. Obviously, those who opposed Christianity denied that Jesus actually rose from the dead as claimed by the Gospels. No surprise there. But there are other details which critics of Christianity admitted were true. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was born about 20 years after the death of Jesus, would have been surrounded by many people who lived during Jesus' time. He wrote about how Emperor Nero framed Christians for starting a deadly fire that was probably his own doing. According to Tacitus, therefore, to squelch the rumor, Nero created scapegoats and subjected to the most refined tortures those whom the common people called Christians, hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ, who, during the reign of Tiberius, had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for the moment, the deadly superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the land which originated this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all sorts of horrendous and shameful practices from every part of the world converse and are fervently cultivated. It's obvious that Tacitus was not friendly towards Christianity, but notice what details he confirms. Jesus existed and was called Christ. He lived during the reign of Tiberius and was executed under Pilate. The Christian movement ended after Jesus was killed, but suddenly started up again and spread rapidly. It might leave you wondering why Christianity suddenly found new life after Jesus was killed. The Jewish Talmud accuses Jesus of leading the Jews astray through his practice of sorcery. This implies that the Jews believed Jesus really did supernatural things. Granted, the Talmud was written roughly 500 years after the time of Jesus, but the Talmud was made to preserve the oral communication of the Jews passed down over history. So it likely reflects an argument that the Jews made many years earlier. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that the Jews accused Jesus of performing miracles from demonic powers rather than from God. We could also look at Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century. He said that Jesus was a doer of startling deeds. Granted, these particular words are surrounded by verbiage that sounds suspiciously Christian, so it's possible his words were messed with by Christians. However, his phrase, startling deeds, does not sound Christian at all, so it's likely that part was authentic. There's one more detail I want to show you, and it comes from our reading of Matthew 28:11-15. In this passage, Jesus had just resurrected, and Matthew tells of how the Romans responded. He says this: "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." Now, obviously, these are not enemies of Jesus talking. This is Matthew talking. But look at what he says. Matthew tells about the Roman guards secretly striking a deal with the Jews to say that the disciples of Jesus stole his body from the tomb. Why do you suppose Matthew said this? Why do these words exist in the book of Matthew? Probably because there were Roman guards telling people that the disciples stole the body from the tomb. So Matthew is battling that objection to help people in his own time believe that Jesus truly resurrected. If the Roman guards were never saying that the body was stolen, Matthew would never supply a counter-argument. Now, if it's true that Romans were saying that the disciples stole the body from the tomb, this means that the Romans admitted the tomb was empty. They could not find the body of Jesus. So I hope it's clear that although the enemies of Jesus have always denied the core proclamation of Jesus' resurrection, there are many other details that they admit, such as Jesus' amazing deeds, his death, the empty tomb, and the fast rise of Christianity after the death of Jesus despite persecution. This provides even further evidence that the Gospels are historically reliable in addition to everything we've discussed throughout this series. We can be confident that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide good historical insights into the life, ministry, death, and even the resurrection of Jesus. I want to thank you for your time going through this series. I hope that helped provide a good perspective for how Christians like me are able to place our trust in the Gospels of Jesus. If this was helpful, I'd encourage you to subscribe, check out some of my other videos where I discuss many other questions related to Christian belief, invite me to speak at your church or youth event. I'd love to continue serving you guys however I can. And by the way, I never shared this earlier in my series, but the word gospel means good news. We call them Gospels because the story of Jesus is good news. that although we have separated ourselves from God because of sin, God became man. His name was Jesus. He lived among us. He died on the cross as payment for our sins and resurrected from the dead. This is the good news that the Gospels proclaim. It's the central message of Christianity, and it means that we can be united with God both now and forever by trusting in the saving power of Jesus. In light of everything we've learned, I urge you to consider Christianity and the life that God offers us in Christ.